They introduced every single person at that table. My mom, my brother's girlfriend, who they had only met 4 months earlier. They even introduced the neighbor who drove them to the venue. And me? I was sitting right there, 3 seats down from my father. In a room full of his colleagues, his boss, and 30 years' worth of his professional life. And my father looked at his boss, smiled that proud smile I had spent my whole childhood chasing, and said, and I quote, "Oh, and that's just my daughter. She's not really doing anything worth mentioning. Not really doing anything worth mentioning." I want you to let that sit for a second. Because I did. I sat there, in that banquet hall, with a glass of sparkling water in my hand, and I let those words pour over me like ice. I didn't cry. I didn't make a scene. I just smiled, nodded, and thought, okay. You have no idea what's in that folder on the table in front of your boss right now. You have absolutely no idea. But we're going to get there, because this story doesn't start at that dinner table. It starts about 6 months earlier, and if you want to understand why that moment felt like the universe finally paying attention, you need to know everything that led up to it. So grab whatever you're drinking, get comfortable. Because this one is personal, it is long overdue, and honey, it is so satisfying. My name is irrelevant for the purposes of this story. What matters is that I am the middle child, the only daughter, and for as long as I can remember, I have existed in my family as background noise. My older brother, Marcus, was the golden son. Athletic, charismatic, the kind of person who filled a room and made my parents feel like they had won some kind of parenting lottery. My younger brother, Daniel, was the baby, and babies in families like mine get a kind of permanent grace, a forever forgiveness that means nothing they do is ever quite wrong enough to matter. And then there was me, right there in the middle, not exceptional in the ways my family understood exceptionalism. Not loud enough, not a boy, not an athlete, just a girl who read too many books and asked too many questions, and apparently, according to my mother when I was 14 years old, made everything more complicated than it needed to be. I grew up in a house where achievement was everything, but only certain kinds of achievement counted. My father, Robert, worked for the same engineering and consulting firm for 32 years. He was proud of that in the way only men of his generation can be, with a kind of bone-deep, unspoken certainty that his work defined his worth, and by extension, his family's worth. Status mattered. Appearances mattered. What the neighbors thought, what his colleagues thought, what his boss thought, these things were the invisible architecture of our entire household. And what did I do? I went into the arts. Specifically, I studied graphic design and visual communications in college, graduated with honors, though my parents only came to the ceremony because Marcus called them and told them it would look bad if they didn't. And then I spent the next several years building something. Quietly. Without fanfare. Without my parents ever really asking about it. I freelanced first. I took every project I could get. I worked nights and weekends. I built a portfolio that I was genuinely proud of. And then, about 4 years ago, I took a risk that terrified me. I co-founded a small branding and design studio with my best friend Priya and a third partner named Jonah who had a background in marketing strategy. We called it Lumen Creative. And it was small at first. It was really small. But we were good. We were disciplined and we were good. And the work spoke for itself in ways I never knew how to speak for myself around my family. By the time my father's retirement party rolled around, Lumen Creative had 17 full-time employees. We had worked with clients in 4 countries. We had won 2 regional design awards that year alone. We had just And this is the part I need you to hold on to. We had just been contracted to rebrand the entire visual identity of a mid-sized technology company that was preparing for a significant public expansion. It was the biggest contract we had ever landed. It represented more money than my father had made in his last 3 years of employment combined. I know that because my mother, in a moment of uncharacteristic candor, had once complained about his salary at the dinner table when I was in high school. I remembered numbers like that. I always had, but my parents didn't know any of this. Not really. Not in detail. Because every time I tried to tell them, my mother would change the subject to Marcus's new car or Daniel's girlfriend or something. Anything that didn't require her to understand what I did or why it mattered. My father would nod in the vague, distracted way he had been nodding at me since I was about 12. "That's nice, sweetheart." That was his line. That was always his line. "That's nice, sweetheart." Said the same way you'd acknowledge someone telling you the weather. So I stopped trying to explain it. I stopped bringing it up at family dinners. I kept my professional life in a separate compartment, somewhere safe, somewhere they couldn't minimize it or misunderstand it or accidentally make me feel small about it. I protected it the way you protect something precious, by keeping it away from people who don't know how to handle fragile things. And then the retirement party invitation arrived. My father's firm was hosting a formal retirement dinner for him at a hotel ballroom. 32 years with the company. His boss, a man named Gerald Whitmore, who had been with the firm almost as long as my father had, was organizing the whole thing. It was going to be a significant event. Speeches, presentations, a slideshow of career highlights, the whole production. Spouses and immediate family were invited and encouraged to attend. I almost didn't go. I genuinely considered not going. Priya actually looked at me over our office table one afternoon and said, "You don't owe them your presence just because he's your father," and she was right. But I also knew that if I didn't go, my mother would make it into a story about me being difficult, about me always ruining things, and I didn't want to give her that. So, I RSVP'd. Yes, I bought a dress I felt confident in, and I decided that I was going to this dinner as myself, the version of myself that I had built without their help, without their belief, without even their basic curiosity. Here's the part where I need to tell you about Gerald Whitmore, because Gerald is the unexpected hero of this story. About 2 months before the retirement dinner, I got an email. It came through Lumen Creative's general inquiry inbox, and Priya flagged it for me because the sender's company was listed as Whitmore Aldridge Group, which I recognized immediately as Gerald's firm, the very firm my father had worked at his whole career. The inquiry was from Gerald's executive assistant, and it was asking whether our studio would be available for an initial consultation regarding a comprehensive rebranding project for one of their subsidiary companies. I stared at that email for a long time, and I thought about a lot of things. I thought about whether this was a conflict of interest in some way. I thought about whether my father had mentioned me to Gerald, but that seemed laughable, truly laughable, given the "that's nice, sweetheart" energy I had been receiving my entire adult life. I thought about the coincidence of it, and then I thought, no, this is not a coincidence to walk away from. This is the universe handing me something, and I am going to take it. I responded professionally. I set up the consultation. I prepared a presentation with Jonah and Priya, and the three of us walked into Gerald Whitmore's offices on a Thursday morning in early autumn, and gave what I genuinely believe was one of the best presentations Lumen Creative had ever delivered. Gerald was attentive. He asked sharp questions. He had clearly done his research on us before we walked in the door. And at the end of the meeting, he looked at me specifically, not Jonah, not Priya, me. And he said, "I've been looking for a studio with this kind of vision for 2 years. I think we found what we're looking for." We got the contract, we started the work, and in the months that followed, Gerald and I had several working calls and one additional in-person meeting. He was warm, professional, and genuinely interested in what we were building with Lumen. At no point in any of these conversations did either of us mention my father. I don't know if he even knew my last name connected me to Robert at that point. It simply never came up. We were operating in a completely separate professional context, and that was exactly as it should have been, until the retirement dinner. I arrived at the hotel venue about 20 minutes before the dinner started. My mother greeted me at the entrance with her usual combination of mild surprise that I had dressed appropriately and faint disappointment that I existed at all, which is a very specific energy that only certain daughters of certain mothers will truly understand. Marcus was there with his wife. Daniel was there with his new girlfriend. Everyone was cheerful and self-congratulatory in the way families are at events that are technically about someone else, but functionally about the collective image they project together. My father was at the center of it, beaming. He looked genuinely happy, and I felt something complicated about that. This mix of real warmth for him, because he was my father, and 32 years is a long time, and this old, tired grief for the relationship we had never quite managed to have. I hugged him. I told him I was proud of him. He said, "Thanks, kiddo," and turned back to a colleague who was telling a story about a golf game. And then Gerald Whitmore walked in. I saw him before he saw me. He came in with 2 other senior people from the firm, and he was scanning the room in that efficient way that people who run organizations tend to scan rooms, taking inventory, identifying faces, orienting himself. And then his eyes landed on me, and his face did something that I will treasure for the rest of my life. He looked genuinely delighted. He crossed the room toward me immediately and extended his hand and said, "I had no idea Robert's daughter was the Sloan from Lumen Creative. He never told me." And I smiled and said, "He doesn't really talk about my work much." Gerald shook his head and said, "Well, that is his loss and our gain, because what your studio is doing for the Aldridge subsidiary is exceptional. Truly exceptional. I've been telling people about your team for weeks." We talked for several minutes, easy, warm, collegial conversation between 2 people who had been working well together. My father was across the room. He hadn't seen this exchange yet. Dinner was called. We were seated at a long family table near the front of the room, and Gerald was at the adjacent table, the firm's leadership table, which was positioned close enough that there was a natural social overlap between the 2 groups throughout the evening. During the cocktail portion, Gerald had placed what I can only describe as a presentation folder on the table, the kind of formal document portfolio that gets prepared for significant contract signings and milestone presentations. It was a Lumen Creative folder. Our branding was on the cover. I hadn't put it there. Gerald had brought it himself, apparently intending to discuss some final details with me at some point during the evening. It was sitting there, our logo facing upward, completely visible to anyone who looked at that table. My father hadn't noticed it, not yet. The dinner proceeded. The speeches happened. They were warm and funny, and my father cried a little, which I had never seen him do, and it moved me more than I expected. There was applause, there was wine, and then there was that moment. The moment I described to you at the very beginning of this story. Gerald came over to our table to personally congratulate my father and to be introduced to the family. My mother was in her element. She introduced herself with the full force of her social charm. She introduced Marcus and his wife with visible pride. She introduced Daniel and his girlfriend. She introduced the neighbor who had carpooled with them to the venue. And then my father, smiling at Gerald, his boss, his longtime colleague, the man he had been trying to impress for 3 decades, looked at me and said it. "Oh, and that's just my daughter. She's not really doing anything worth mentioning." The table went quiet in that particular way that means everyone heard it and no one knows what to do. I saw Marcus glance down at his plate. I saw Daniel's girlfriend blink. And Gerald Whitmore looked at my father with an expression I cannot fully describe, somewhere between astonishment and something that looked almost like pity. And he said, "Robert, do you know who your daughter is?" My father laughed a little, confused. "What do you mean? That's Sloan." And Gerald said, "That's Sloan of Lumen Creative. Her firm has been handling the Aldridge rebranding project. I have been working with her for the past 2 months. I flew her team in to meet with us. I have been recommending her studio to every contact I have in the industry." He paused. Then he picked up the Lumen Creative folder from his table, walked 2 steps, and placed it gently in front of my father. "This is what she's been doing, Robert. I'd encourage you to take a look." The silence at that table was the most complete silence I have ever experienced. My father opened the folder. Inside was a full project brief, campaign visuals, brand identity documents, the entire scope of what my team had built. It was beautiful. It was professional. It was undeniably impressive, and it was undeniably mine. His eyes moved over the pages slowly. I watched his face as he read. I watched the moment when the scale of it registered. When he understood not just what I did, but how well I did it. And that his boss, the man whose opinion had organized 32 years of my father's professional identity, had been singing my praises in rooms my father was never in. My mother had gone very still beside him. I didn't say anything triumphant. I didn't make a speech. I just sat there, in the dress I had chosen for myself, at the table where I had always been background noise, and I let the moment exist exactly as it was. Gerald turned to me before returning to his table and said warmly, "We're lucky to have found you, Sloan. Your father should be very proud." And he walked away. After the dinner, in the parking lot, my father found me before I reached my car. He looked older than he had looked inside, smaller somehow. He said, "I didn't know." And I said, "I know you didn't." He said, "You never told us." And I said, very gently, very honestly, "Dad, I tried. You weren't interested." He didn't argue with that. He just nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are absorbing something they cannot immediately fix. My mother called me the following week. The conversation was awkward and uncomfortable and not quite an apology. More of a renegotiation, an attempt to reframe. We always knew you were capable." I let her talk. I didn't fight her on the framing. I had already received everything I actually needed in that banquet hall. Because here is what I want you to take from this story. And I mean this genuinely, from one person to whoever is watching this right now. I did not build Lumen Creative to prove something to my parents. I built it because I believed in what we were making, and because Priya and Jonah believed in it too, and because the work itself was worth doing regardless of who was watching. The proof was never the point. The work was the point. The proof was just a byproduct. But there is something deeply, quietly human about being seen by the right person in the right room. About having someone who has no reason to advocate for you decide to advocate for you anyway. Purely because the work earned it. Gerald Whitmore didn't know he was handing me anything that night. He was just being accurate. He was just saying what was true. And sometimes that's all it takes. If you have people in your life who have decided who you are before you finished becoming it, I want you to hear this. Keep building. Keep doing the work in the rooms they're not in. Keep being excellent in the spaces they don't know about, because the world is large and it is full of Gerald Whitmores, people who will look at what you've made and say, clearly and without hesitation, that it matters. You don't need permission to matter. You never did. Thank you for watching. If this story hit you somewhere familiar, drop it in the comments. I read every single one. Subscribe if you're new here, because we have so many more stories where this came from. And until next time, remember, the best revenge is always, always the life you built while they weren't paying attention. Take care of yourselves.